Well, this is a special evening tonight, and we truly appreciate you coming out and joining ISW on an evening when we're going to honor a prominent national leader who has provided a lifetime of service and leadership to this great country of ours. And that, of course, is Senator Joe Lieberman. And we're delighted to have his wife, Adasa, here tonight to join him. We appreciate it, ma'am, that you're here, who's been side by side with him on this entire journey. Almost a quarter of a century in the Senate, and following it, an early life of public service in his beloved state of Connecticut. And what Senator Lieberman has always done that we feel so strongly about is his commitment to national defense. And it's always been there, right from the beginning. In addition to that, moreover, when it was recognized that force had to be used, and we're always reluctant to do that, but when it needed to be used, Senator Lieberman, without equivocation, was for that use of force. And he's also here tonight with his sidekick, if I can be a little bit casual and informal, Senator John McCain, one of the three amigos, a term affectionately given to them by General Dave Petraeus. And the other aspect of this, the two of them, when they believed that, and had strong feelings about it, when you're fighting a war, you should win that war. Now that seems obvious to most people, but trust me, it's not that obvious. So despite what always happens in war, which are setbacks, profound disappointments, and more setbacks, if you're going to win, it takes leadership and perseverance to get you through all of that and never lose sight of what you're trying to achieve. And they, arm in arm, were for all of that and provided actually moral courage to many of our leaders who are trying to do the very same thing in the field. When I think of Senator Lieberman, what comes to my mind immediately is character, courage, and compassion. Not only did he earn the respect of all of his colleagues in the Senate and also in the House of Representatives, but he earned the respect of the American people. So it's a real pleasure for us to honor him tonight. And what's going to happen here is Dr. Kagan, president of ISW, is going to conduct an interview with Senator Lieberman. You'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. After that, we're going to go to dinner, and we're going to have an award presentation. Dr. Kagan.
Thank you so much, General Keane. You have been such a phenomenal leader and chairman for us at ISW, and thank you so much, Senator Lieberman, for joining us here tonight and for agreeing to talk about policy as well as agreeing to talk to have us talk about you and the service that you've provided.
Thanks, Kim. I'm happy to do both. Really, that was a much appreciated statement. General Jack Keane was a great American patriot, really has informed a lot of the work that I've been privileged to do with John McCain over the years. Great to have John here. To have in the same room my sidekick and my wife. Really, this is good. And to have them hear your kind words, but I know Hadassah will make sure that I stay close to the ground, and when we get home, that I take the garbage out. You know. Anyway, I'm honored, really honored to be honored by this group, and Kim, with what's that guy's name? Fred.
He's all right.
Yeah. Kim and Fred have really provided extraordinary service as others at ISW have. So I thank you very much, and I'll have more to say, although briefly, of a laudatory nature later.
I am happy to get to the policy questions
Okay.
because I think that there's really quite a lot to talk about. And I think we're here in an interesting time and an interesting precipice of American national security issues and affairs. Now, I think you've probably seen these precipices before, but I don't know. I would like to know whether you think that we are in a unique strategic environment now, different from an environment that you've seen over your career service.
I do. So I'm ending, as Jack said, 24 years in the Senate at the end of this year, about a quarter of a century. So if I take a quick look back when I came into the Senate in 1989, the threat environment, the strategic environment was remarkably different. I mean, we were in a great power conflict with a single great power, the Soviet Union. And while it was serious and threatening in many ways, it was much more simple. I mean, it was really a global conflict between two great powers with remarkably different ideological views of not just the world, but of sort of human nature and the rights that people had. Today, there's no such one great power opponent, but we face a series of threats, and it makes the threat environment all the more challenging to defend against. So, I mean, I would say that just to list quickly, so we obviously face the threat of violent Islamist extremism in two forms. The first is non-state and Sunni, which is Al-Qaeda, the group that attacked us on 9/11, and would, given the opportunity and the means, attack us again in whatever way they possibly could. The second is state-sponsored Shia Islamist extremism, which is Iran, of course. So I think those are two very different kinds of threats that emerge on totally unconventional battlefields, particularly Al-Qaeda, not coming at us in uniform, not coming at us on battleships or in tanks or fighter aircraft, but coming out of the shadows and attacking civilians. It's a very different kind of conflict, which I think we've gotten better at defending against. We also have a very different kind of challenge, which is very different. The threat of a rising China, growing in both economic power and military strength. Not necessarily a military adversary in terms of actual open conflict, but doubling its military budget, and with it, for reasons that are both economic and in some ways, I think, psychological, asserting itself much more aggressively in the Asia Pacific. So it's a very different kind of environment. The ways in back in the 90s, I guess, I first heard the term asymmetrical warfare. What the heck is that? So it's not great power on great power. It's an asymmetrical enemy attacking us, a great power, in a way that gets around our strength. So terrorism is obviously one way to do that, as we saw in 9/11, and cyber warfare is another. I guess I'd say that maybe there's a final challenge now, which relates to all the others. Maybe we'll talk about it more later, which is the question of whether we're prepared to continue to commit adequate resources to our national defense. If there's anything I learned, or maybe relearned, because I learned it when I was a student studying the Constitution, is that the one main irreplaceable responsibility that the federal government has is national defense, is to provide for the common defense. And last year, the Budget Control Act was adopted, which cut $500 billion out of the defense budget over the next decade. If sequestration goes into effect, it'll be another half trillion, and we're already accepting unacceptable risk as a result of that. So I wrap it up that way to say that we've got to win that battle at home so we can continue to defend against Al-Qaeda, Iran, and meet the rising threat of China in the Asia Pacific.
I'd actually like to talk a little bit about the defense policy and about that unacceptable risk, and then we can move back out
Good.
from the resources into that strategic environment. First of all, what is that? We talk about risk very often when we talk about our national defense, and we talk about levels of unacceptable risk. But can you tell me more specifically what you think that is, and what risks we may be taking should we move towards sequestration or further budget cuts? And how will that have an impact on
Right.
our military primacy?
So, look, the less money we commit to defense, the smaller and less adequately equipped our military will be, and the fewer responsibilities they can take on. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to know that. And so let's start with the Navy. The Navy is now down to, I believe, 285 ships, and it's going to drop another 9 in the next year or two. The administration has, whatever word you use, made this pivot or rebalancing to the Asia Pacific, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail. That is mostly a matter of the presence of the Navy. At the same time, the greatest immediate threats to us are coming from the Middle East, broadly speaking, and Iran particularly, but and we have great economic and strategic interests there. So we can't do both of those well with a 285 or lower ship Navy. The way you can do it is to really stress your force. And we're beginning to do that, and stress your equipment. You're going to begin to do damage to the vessels and give the Navy personnel less time at home, and that's going to create morale problems. I mean, so we're not going to be able to carry out those responsibilities. Look, as a result of the Budget Control Act, there are required cuts of 92,000 in Army and Marine personnel. Believe it or not, that's going to require what they call, in other parts of government, RIFs. There's going to be actually layoffs of Army personnel, particularly, because there'll be involuntary terminations. So that's an outrageous effect, particularly in an economy where a lot of those folks are going to have trouble finding jobs. But if there's anything I've learned, and here again, you don't have to be a genius or deserve an award from the ISW to say this, there are always going to be surprises. I mean, look back at the last period of time when I've been here. I mean, who would have guessed that, we didn't see 9/11 coming. We didn't see the Soviet Union collapsing. We didn't see Arab Spring coming. I mean, we could go on, and therefore you've got to really size your military, both in terms of personnel and equipment, for a wide range of contingencies. I think right now, just carrying out the Budget Control Act, let alone the threat of sequestration, we don't have the necessary equipment or personnel. I mean, I left out the Air Force. They're going to buy fewer planes this year in this year's budget than in memory. I forgot the exact number of years.
Let's talk a little bit about that strategic environment and about the strategic pivot to Asia. Is an Asia-focused military posture the correct alignment for the strategic environment that we're in?
Well, obviously, the Asia-Pacific region is very important. The stability there is very important to our prosperity, to our security, to the world's prosperity, to the world's security. So it's important that we have a presence there, but and a really a robust, healthy presence there, because we are indispensable there. I'll come back to that in a minute. But if we do that at the by taking personnel and Navy presence and the rest out of the Middle East, for instance, we're going to expose another flank. And so the idea of a pivot is a bad idea. I guess if we're saying that the Asia-Pacific is important to our security, that's important to say. Incidentally, the point I want to make here, it speaks to the extraordinary role that the U.S. military has played in the world, and now I'm going to go back before my time to the post-Second World War period, but the continuing presence of the U.S. military in the Asia-Pacific, again, particularly the Navy, has been the guarantor of maritime security, maritime freedom of movement, which has been the precondition for the extraordinary growth and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific. Incidentally, from which we have grown in our prosperity because of the trade that we do. And that simply wouldn't have happened if the U.S. wasn't the guarantor of that commerce. We also created the stability in which a remarkable number of people, so I would say hundreds of millions of people in the Asia-Pacific came out of poverty in direct relationship to our role in maintaining stability there. The other thing is we created a stable context and a role model for the broad expansion of freedom in the Asia-Pacific. But it's not quite right to say that we haven't. So I make that point to say, one, it's not like we've been ignoring the Asia-Pacific. We've been there. We developed in the Bush administration, particularly our relations with India, which were very important. So the truth is we need to be focused on both of those critical regions. Just to run this answer a little longer than I should be, but it's important. The whole idea that you kind of put a wall between the Asia-Pacific here and the Middle East there, it doesn't work. It's not like these are contiguous parts of the world, and they relate in many ways. I mean, sometimes in leaping over ways that are not good. I mean, the North Koreans, after all, are the ones who are building the nuclear plant in Syria. Look, we think of India as part of Asia, but the Indian government, our ally, care a lot about what happens in Pakistan. And that's a very fragile, difficult relationship. What happens in Pakistan is impacted by what happens in Afghanistan. So if we sort of are withdrawing from Afghanistan and that whole region, it's not like we can hold it in its impact in the Middle East. It's going to affect Asia in those many ways. The other thing to say really briefly, I was struck some years ago, and it was actually after the surge began to turn things around in Iraq. I was at that Shangri-La Security Conference in Singapore, and I was in a conversation with 3 defense ministers from Asia-Pacific allies of ours. A long way. These are South China Sea area allies, a long way from Iraq. And they were expressing their relief that we did not exit Iraq in defeat. Why? First, because it would have undercut their reliance on us for their own security, for obvious reasons. If you're going to leave them, why won't you leave us? The second, in a more constructive way or more positive way, the fact that we hung in there said to them that they could rely on us, and therefore it gave them the sense of security to go ahead and continue to be our allies and not feel that they had to be pressured into accommodating to China, which they don't want to do.
I would love to think a little bit more about the threat of violent Islamic extremism, which you had mentioned on your list of great threats to the United States. I'd like to ask you whether you think that Al-Qaeda is in decline or on the rise.
And it seems to be both at once. I mean, but ultimately it's not gone. I mean, parts of Al-Qaeda are obviously in decline. A lot of the top leadership, including Osama bin Laden, has been eliminated. But it's appearing and metastasizing in a lot of other places. And so anybody who thinks that you're going to end this threat, which is a threat of Sunni Islamist extremism and terrorism, by killing a few people at the top, it's not going to be that easy, unfortunately. And of course, we see it now in places like Yemen and Somalia, and now in Mali, opening up a new front, coming in their own way back into Iraq, present in Syria. I mean, this is an ideology, and so you don't wipe out an ideology by wiping out even the person who became its leading spokesperson, bin Laden. And incidentally, Zawahiri still seems to be playing a role as the heir to bin Laden. He still seems to be playing at least an inspirational role, and I suspect more with regard to some of the Al-Qaeda activities in other parts of the world, Middle East and North Africa particularly.
So if we are actually wrestling with an organization with such a potent ideology and a determination to create disorder and also to inflict harm on the United States, how do we actually deal with that as a security threat? What are the additional steps that we need to take and continue taking in order to make sure that we are not again surprised as we were on 9/11 or as we were on 9/11 this year in Benghazi?
Right. So I think the one part of this is defense, and it happens by twist of fate. The committee I've been on, that I played a role in the creation of the post 9/11 Homeland Security changes that have occurred, beginning with the department, but also John and I put in the legislation that created the 9/11 Commission, and then we adopted the legislation to reform the intelligence community to make up for some of the gaps that occurred on 9/11/01, which I think together represented the most significant reform, certainly in the intelligence community, maybe in our national security organizations, since the 40s, quite appropriately at the beginning of the Cold War. So we've raised our defense, and it's part of why we've not suffered another attack like 9/11 here. But this is all a question of trying to empower the moderate forces in the Arab world. And this is where what might seem like an accident of history came along, which was the Arab Spring. And I think ultimately the best defense against violent Islamist extremism is democracy. Democracy also is no guarantee. So while we see some of the Arab Spring countries like Tunisia and actually Libya, for the most part, doing pretty well in their first elections, others, like Egypt and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood to leadership there, worry us. But ultimately, every time people have actually had most times people have had an opportunity in the Arab world to vote, they've indicated that they're certainly not for violent Islamist extremism. This requires presence, and I don't want to take too much time on this, but I think, as you know, Kim, that it was a mistake that we withdrew all our forces from Iraq, or put it another way, that we were unable to reach an agreement with the Iraqi government to have a follow-on force there, because that would have been a way to continue to send a message to the Iraqis that we were there just in case. It would enable us to continue to play a counterterrorism role and a training role. And it would have said to our enemies, both Al-Qaeda and Iran, we're not going anywhere. In fact, today in Iraq, Al-Qaeda and Iran are back. And so it's a combination of supporting democracy, supporting democratic forces in the Arab and Muslim world, and maintaining a military presence, different from when we were at war, but clearly there.
as we think about these Arab Spring countries and wrestle with the problems of the radical ideologies, both Sunni and Shia, that you have described, somehow the crisis in Syria leaps to the forefront of my mind, and I would like to ask you about that. Do you see Syria's future on a trajectory that will increase the threat of violent extremism, either state-sponsored or non-state-sponsored, or do you see it on a trajectory that will come to some other end? How do we get
Right.
there? How do we get to some
Yeah.
other end?
So I think that the answer to that today is a lot more complicated and uncertain for me than it would have been a year ago or a year and a half ago if we had gotten more rapidly, we and our allies in Europe and in the Arab world had gotten more rapidly involved on behalf of the opposition to Assad. And I never have understood, and I will never understood, why we've waited so long. John and I were over there early in this conflict, and it's certainly our considered judgment, I say mine for now, that the people who began that uprising against Assad after he turned his guns on them were really Syrian patriots. They were not Islamist extremists. They were mostly Sunni, it's true. They were probably subject to some secular antagonisms, but the fact that we've not at least given them the weapons with which to fight, including anti-aircraft weapons, has done two things. It's radicalized them, I'm afraid, in a secular sense, where they now do want to settle scores with some of the Alawites, and that'll make a peaceful conclusion of or a peaceful transition to a post-Assad Syria more difficult. But it's also meant that the door is open to more radical extremists coming in. I mean, one of the last times John and I were in Istanbul meeting with two very impressive leaders of the Free Syrian Army, both people who had left the Syrian army after 20 or 30 years. These were not kids. And they did it at some peril. They were very committed to the fight. I remember one of them said to us, he pleaded with us for weapons with which to fight. But he said, if you don't give us, or the world doesn't help us, we'll fight with whatever we have. And we'll never give up because we